Here we are at the southern entrance of the Natchez Trace Parkway, a 429-mile national park. We are approximately 8 miles northeast of Natchez, Mississippi. Today we will be visiting a portion of the old Trace, Emerald Mounds, and the Mount Locust site on this national park. We will also be visiting Grand Village State Park and Museum in Natchez, seeking more knowledge of the Natchez Indians and their involvement in the building of Emerald Mounds. President Jefferson in 1801 decided that a road from Nashville to Natchez was necessary for the safety and welfare of the nation. U.S. soldiers built the road. Ohio Valley pioneers floated their products to Natchez or New Orleans in flat-bottom boats and returned home afoot or on horseback over the Natchez Trace. Across the parkway behind you is a portion of the old Natchez Trace, a wilderness road that grew from wild animals and Indian trails. Traders, soldiers, Kentucks, post riders, circuit riding preachers, outlaws, settlers, and adventurers trampled a national road. Here's the Natchez Trace, a bond that held the Southwest to the rest of the nation, a channel for the flow of people and ideas, a memorial to the thousands whose footsteps stamped into the American land. The old Natchez Trace, worn by a century and a half of traffic, is now a sunken, tree-lined road, in places 30 feet deep. Imagine yourself, almost 2 centuries ago, traveling by foot or horseback down the trace. The trip along the trace was no doubt long and wearisome compared to today's travel. Here is one of the stands which were homes along the Natchez Trace where travelers sought lodging on their long journey back to Nashville. Okay, here we are on the southern end of the Natchez Trace. We're about 8 miles north of Natchez, and Bob Kramer is here with us today and going to give us a rundown on the Mount Locust area here, and we'll just turn it over to Bob Kramer.
Thank you, and welcome to Mount Locust here on the Natchez Trace Parkway. We're part of the National Park Service, the Natchez Trace, and this house that we'll walk through today happens to be the only remaining what we call a stand or an overnight lodging place still in existence on the trace itself. The house started as just one room, built during the Revolutionary War times. It was part of a land grant that the British gave to anybody willing to come out here, basically, to build something of a sturdy structure, at least 16 by 20 feet in size. Now, as you walked up to the house here, you were walking on a portion of the old trace, this paved pathway. Back then, about 200 years ago, it wasn't paved. It was just a forest trail that actually originated perhaps thousands of years ago as an animal pathway for deer and buffalo and bison and animals of that sort. Then later on, the Native Americans, the Indians, used the trails for hunting and getting from one village to another. Later on, when the European settlers came here in the late 1700s, they started to use the trail too. It was the story of the boatmen going downriver on the Mississippi River, which lies about 10 miles west of us here as the crow flies. But back around 1780 or so, those boatmen built flat-bottom boats, and they were going downriver to sell their produce and manufactured goods down at Natchez. Then they had to walk back home because this is in the era before steamships, and you just couldn't fight that current, you know, trying to paddle upstream. So they were walking back home, and by coincidence, this particular house happened to be about a day's walk out of Natchez. Basically, it was a family farmhouse, originating, as I mentioned, as one room, But later on, as the family got larger, so did the house. So when we walk through the house, keep in mind what you're looking at is a scene back around 1810. And for its time frame, this house was a real luxury too, having glass window panes and paneled woodwork and paint, a wooden floor. That was pretty good for the frontier setting. So the story here basically is about people on the move, the boatmen going downriver and having to walk back home. And the reason they walked is because horses were too expensive back then for the average person. Now, if you were, say, Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson, you could afford a horse, or maybe some of the entrepreneurs and perhaps a preacher might have a horse. But for the typical person, walking was the way to get back home. And back then, it might take you, maybe 2 or 3 months to get all the way back home. And by home, I mean Kentucky and places further north. In fact, they were called Kaintucks back then, at least the original people who were walking back home. So by accident, this house became a place where travelers towards the end of the day would knock on the door, tired and hungry, maybe footsore, a place where they can find a little refuge and rest up. So the folks who lived here basically were in business in 2 different ways. They were basically corn farmers. So they tilled the land, they raised their crops, but they were forced to accommodate these travelers. And it was pretty hard to say no when perhaps 15 and 20 people at a time were knocking on your door, because that's how the people traveled back then on the old trace, in large numbers. Safety meant traveling in packs because you had a lot of cutthroats out on the trace, willing to take your life perhaps and take your money, because the bad people knew that you had gone down to Natchez on your flat-bottom boats and you had money. You had sold your produce and manufactured things. So you had to survive back then. In fact, adaptability and perhaps luck was the key to survival, whether you were walking on the old trace or if you lived here on the farm sites. As we walk through the house, you'll see adaptation for survival. Just the fact that the house itself is built up on posts away from the damp ground meant that the house could last much longer, perhaps away from the termites or just the rots. And you could also use the bottom for storage. And other things about the house were built for adaptation and survival. You'll walk through, you'll see the kitchen was separated from the house also. So if you burn the kitchen down with your cooking, at least you didn't burn the house down. So little things were adaptations. Having a large family was an adaptation for survival, because a lot of kids died young back then. There were a lot of diseases, yellow fever, bronchitis could be fatal. Cut your finger, you could die. So you had to kind of hedge your bet and have a large family. So let's walk through, and I can tell you more of the story about how the people survived back then, in a time when you were really living on the edge of the frontier. So let's start with the first room, if possible. This was built around 1780 during the Revolutionary War. We call it the tap room, but a better phrase or description might call it the everything room, because here is where you ate, you slept. If you had travelers, you might have even invited somebody inside the house to sleep on the floor or maybe on some kind of a straw bed, provided they weren't too scruffy and menacing looking. But I think probably later on, knowing human nature, as their family got larger and they wanted more privacy, I would kind of doubt that as many people slept inside the house, but rather perhaps on the porch, or later on they built a separate dormitory out in the backyard. And these folks also apparently built a separate inn out front here, another place for people to sleep. In fact, out front they had a little community going after a while called Uniontown, where you might have had a doctor, a gin mill operator, a blacksmith, carpenter, people of that sort. So this was actually a thriving operation around 1800 or so. So you have to kind of take yourself back in time and try to visualize what it was like back then, remembering that basically this was a forest pathway on the edge of the frontier. And the trace was really very important because you might think of it as the springboard for Manifest Destiny. The trace was the north-south route on the nation's frontier, and this was kind of the link with the eastern cities and the nation's capital. So what happened on the frontier really ultimately affected what happened as the country expanded westward. So let's start by looking here, if you can bring your camera if possible. Take a quick look inside the tap room, or what was originally the one-room house. Well, here we are in the tap room. This is that first room that was the beginning of the house itself, 16 by 20 feet. And it looks like maybe the farm family was expecting some company. Maybe some of the boatmen walking back home, or maybe the family itself. Perhaps the children and the parents are out working in the cornfield now, or chopping wood, scrubbing some of the clothing. They had a lot of work to do back then. In fact, in those days, happiness was kind of a relatively simple concept. Happiness was perhaps sitting in your rocking chair, knowing that the roof isn't leaking and the corn is coming up, the children aren't sick, and there aren't any problems like that. More or less the survival mode. So looking around in the room here, you could just visualize what it must have been like in the past, having the company, the boatmen coming through here, perhaps setting up a bowl of corn mush and some bits of ham or deer meat chopped in if it was available. As far as liquids for drinking something, probably something like tea, sassafras tea, or just plain safe drinking water was a big thing back then. You want to drink out of a dirty puddle. But this was luxury, having a wooden floor and paint. And as you pan your camera, you'll see that the furniture back then was quite nice for the frontier setting. They did have also a fireplace in most of the rooms. They made their own bricks in the backyard. So let's move the camera and see more of the room if possible. The furniture in this room isn't necessarily of the people who lived here. It's just of that particular period. Some of it is antique, some of it actually is reproduction. But we think this is an old original piece of that era, this box. And apparently visitors always asked us, you know, is that part of a grandfather clock box, or what was that? And you can see it's really got some nice carving to it. As far as I'm concerned, the box made you feel better. It lifted your spirits because it was used either for putting a Bible in there, or medicine, or whiskey. So regardless of what it was, it made you feel good. People also ask about this box in front of the fireplace here. Invariably people ask, is that a kitty litter box? And we rather doubt that they had cats in the house itself. However, if you're chewing tobacco, you don't want to mess up the nice polished wooden floor. So the box could serve as a cuspidor. But most likely it also served as kind of a fire extinguisher, because you certainly didn't want to burn the house down. And you can see kind of how shallow the fireplace was. So there was always a chance that a log could roll down, or maybe some wild sparks. So the sand was used to snuff out the fire if it got out of control. Perhaps too, who knows, although they had a separate kitchen, they might have boiled, you know, some water, maybe for soup or some other kind of minor cooking, and they could have put the hot vessel in the sandbox too, for safety. But it almost looks like they were expecting guests here, because you have cards there on the table, you have a little chewing tobacco, all the comforts of home, so to speak. far as how much of this room is original, the woodwork. We think that some of the ceiling beams came from the original house, and perhaps some of the planks in the wall, but generally speaking, maybe about 10% or so of the house, the woodwork, is of the original wood that was used back then. In fact, one story is that much of the wood from the original house originated from the boats that went downriver, those flatboats. When they reached Natchez, the lumber was valuable, and since the boats couldn't be brought upstream against the current back then, the boats were scrapped and the wood was recycled. But just imagine how unusual it was in the middle of a forest in the frontier setting to have a house built of paneled woodwork instead of logs that you would expect from the forest. So the people who lived here basically were upper class. This was luxurious living, but still you had to be a survivor. So I suggest we kind of move on to the rest of the house, but if we do have a possibility of showing this real nice black walnut cupboard behind the camera where I'm pointing there, you might want to show that. I know my mother would like to have that cupboard anyways.
I'll certainly do that.
Here we are in a cozy little room. This is the master bedroom where the parents slept. But I imagine if it got cold in the wintertime, the children might have piled into the same bed. You had to keep warm. Speaking of keeping warm, it's a real low ceiling, so that probably helped to keep the heat down where the people could use it also. Because even though it might get warm in the summertime here, you had to survive the winter. Many of the children didn't survive the winter. So you did have to adapt to the weather here. Now these folks made their own bricks. In fact, later on, if you have a chance, you can walk in the backyard and observe the site where the kiln was located. The bed itself might not look comfortable by today's standards, but it does have feathers in there. So that kind of smoothed out the bumps. And after working all day out in the cornfield or scrubbing and cooking, even before the sun came up, anything felt good. One curious thing about sleeping back then was that the custom was not to sleep kind of longwise, but in an upright position, crosswise, which might explain how such a small bed could accommodate 2 people. Or later on you'll see where the boys slept, maybe 3 kids per bed. But this was a cultured family. They did a lot of reading, they had music in the family, and perhaps towards the end of the day, if there was still sufficient sunlight, Grandma Polly, as she was known, might be sitting in her rocker or near the desk reading the Bible, or her husband might be working on some documents pertaining to land acquisition or some kind of an inventory count for his tools or the farm work itself. These were industrious folks, and you had to be hard workers to survive on the frontier. So look around, and from this point we can move on to the room where the children slept, because Grandma Polly bore over 10 children during her lifetime. This is where the boys slept, perhaps 3 kids per bed. Once again, they slept crosswise, sitting up. That saved room, but also it was a custom from Europe. Apparently, it was felt that it was healthier to sleep in an upright position. And back then, I imagine too, sleeping that way kind of helped because of bronchial problems and other childhood diseases that the kids might have had back then. You can imagine with this shallow kind of a fireplace too, it must have been kind of smoky in the house at times. The shallow structure of the fireplaces meant that you could radiate quite a bit of heat out to warm the room itself, but I imagine smoke did come through too. These beds are stuffed with straw, but they might have used Spanish moss or feathers like in the other room, or even corn husks. Corn was the main crop, and they used it for more than one purpose. Now, if you use Spanish moss like that stuff hanging through the window there, I think they probably had to make sure they boiled it or smoked that Spanish moss real thoroughly, otherwise there are a lot of little insects, and talk about bed bugs, you would have them definitely if you didn't treat the Spanish moss first. In addition to the children sleeping here, we think that perhaps there were also relatives, an uncle or some other relation, perhaps sharing a bed like this other one on the far side. In fact, that was another mode of survival and adaptation. Safety in numbers. The more people you had living in the family, the more work you could do. And the more people you had living here on the farm site, the more protection was afforded against those cutthroats out on the old trace. So having a lot of people was definitely an asset back then. I mentioned earlier in the other room about how they made their own bricks. Well, I don't know if you can pan down to this, but there's a dog print right over here on this brick. It's something like Hollywood, you know, you put your imprint in. What happened apparently before the bricks were baked, the pooch pressed down. So now we have kind of a fossilized dog print. I mentioned that these folks had to work hard to survive, but it wasn't just all drudgery either. They must have had times for fun and games. And can't you imagine also perhaps on a Saturday night, a little fiddle music? The uncle who lived here was apparently a very talented musician. So if he wasn't playing a little fiddle music and Virginia reel on the porch, a little dancing, he might have had a tambourine or a bugle, other types of musical instruments itself. Also, the house was the site for home education. You can see a few chalkboards there. And apparently, Grandma Polly, as she was called, was basically a very intelligent lady who had a lot of books in the house and taught the children the 3 R's. So in addition to learning how to hunt and fish and do the basic chores of the house itself and the farm site, these children had a good education for the frontier setting. I'm wearing the famous National Park Service hats. Of course, I work for the National Park Service. Back then, there was a hat that the post riders wore. Now, this kind of style was worn by a lot of people, preachers and businessmen and other travelers on the old trace. Some might have embellished it with a band like this. We're not sure whether the post riders did, but the post riders delivered the mail on the trace, which was a dangerous undertaking. So it's kind of a continuation. They work for the government, I work for the government. That's not our style hat today, but there is that continuity. And speaking of headwear, back then people hunted for survival. That's a gray fox skin over here. And you could picture travelers or just the family members wearing something like that when they're out walking or hunting during the cooler times of the year. A few toys are represented here. The hobby horse, which was training for the real thing because horses were important here, farm animals such as horses, and simple things like this wooden top for the kids to play with. Back then, I think you probably had to use more imagination than today. Pleasures were simple, but for its time frame, this was good living, having a roof over your head and a wooden floor and a close-knit family. So from this point, let's move to the back porch and see another bedroom where the little girl named Philadelphia slept. Now we're inside Philadelphia's room, and she had feathers in her bed. At least that's how we're portraying it right now. Now you see that paddle over there? That wasn't used to whack the kids because you didn't want to hurt your helpers. That was used to kind of smooth out the feathers. on the bed itself. This room apparently doesn't have a fireplace. So back then they quilted a lot. Several layers could keep you warm even in the wintertime. Once again, we're portraying home education with the chalkboards. A few toys here. Corn shuck dolls was another use for corn. You know, corn was important because you ate corn, you made corn mush as part of a meal that you would sell to the travelers who stopped by here. The animals ate corn. The corn husks could also be used for insulation between the paneling of the house. So it was really a multi-purpose crop. You can't eat cotton, that came later. But corn was the survival crop back during the frontier setting of around 1800 or so. This room has a touch of luxury to it also. The curtains, and once again, paint. That was unusual to have paint, by the way, for a frontier house. But these were higher class folk. See, we have a few dice here. Talk about loaded dice. These are made out of lead. So from here, let's move out, perhaps check the back porch and also the storeroom behind us. This ladder leads to a storage loft. And up there, the family could have stored winter clothing and blankets, maybe some onions and other kinds of food to dry out. Maybe somebody slept up there, a few kids, during the cooler weather, but not in the hot time of the year. You don't want to kind of dehydrate, which would happen up there. In some of these overnight stands or inns, we're told that also some of the travelers could have slept up in the loft in some of those places. And if so, it's conceivable that the owner of the inn would have locked them up there for everybody's satisfaction, because some of those characters were kind of wild, pretty scruffy and rough. Maybe they hadn't bathed in a few weeks. So you had to keep everybody happy. This porch, though, could have been used also to sleep a few people also, maybe on the first come, first served basis. But having two porches to the house, one on the front side and one here on the back, really increased the usability and the size of the house. And it's possible, too, that this back porch was enclosed, especially during the winter time. The house itself is a little unusual, as you might have detected. You don't have side access from room to room, because it started just as a one-room house, and perhaps the family wanted privacy, which is why they didn't have these side doorways. On this back porch, you see hanging up those two blankets. This was part of the garb that the boatmen wore, slinging one of these over their shoulder. It's basically a combination of bedroll and backpack. And it's fairly heavy, even though it's light right now. So you didn't want to put too much stuff in here. It was called a budget, because you had to kind of budget your weight in what you put here. So I imagine they would have put dried corn, maybe some smoked meat, something lightweight so they can eat for survival. We're told a newspaper would have been something good to have, because news didn't travel as fast back then, and having a newspaper was always something you could barter or sell, spreading the word of what was going on, especially on this frontier setting. So the boatmen would have had something like this, a canteen of sorts, a hat they could pull down over their eyes in case the bugs got bad or the rain started rolling down, or you wanted to protect your face against the sun. Might have had a pack over another shoulder to carry your money or other essential items. Good chance they might have had a musket over their shoulder too for survival. But behind me here, this is the storeroom. where they kept tools and other utensils that were useful. And also it served as a nursery. And when I say nursery, I don't mean for growing plants, but for growing babies. Unfortunately, in the case of this family, even though there were over 10 children born, only a handful survived. So you did have to hedge your bets. But I guess the people back then were more philosophical or fatalistic about things like that. But it must have been a tragic occurrence for a little child to succumb to things that today we could easily have treated. So let me step aside here. If you want to take a close-up of the storeroom, you can get a general idea of some of the tools and things they might have had back then. And over here is a cistern. There used to be a kitchen here that burned down years ago. And from the roof of the kitchen was a rain gutter, which led into the cistern. We didn't have the lid back then because otherwise you couldn't fill it up after it rained. In fact, it was raining this morning. It's pretty soggy out here. But that was another mode of adaptation for survival back then, getting good drinking water from the roof. We have a cistern there, and there's one off on the left here, too. But back then, just imagine, we're on a hill here, trying to dig down to tap the water for a well would have been impractical in those days because the soil was too crumbly, and being on a hillside like this, it just wouldn't have paid. So having cisterns was the answer. Basically a glorified rain barrel. Behind me also, you can see a small garden. Nothing's coming up yet, but although corn was their basic crop back then, you had to diversify for a change of diet. So you would plant some greens like beans and peas, also melons, so you can get a little vitamin C also. So if you folks come back sometime in the middle of the summertime, we'll offer you some of our produce. Later on in the year, we'll have pumpkins coming up. But that's what they would have had back then, in addition to corn. The kitchen burned down. We have not rebuilt the kitchen. It's not our policy to build things which are no longer in existence in the park. But you can imagine back then having a kitchen and having barns and stables back where I'm pointing. A lot of animals, cows, hogs, perhaps a few sheep. So this was really an active operation back then. Later on it grew to be a plantation. But that was after the steamship was invented and used, and that's not really our story. Because by that time, people weren't using the trace anymore. They were using the steamship to get back home. You can see the dogwoods are starting to come out also. This dogwood is a recent transplant. One of the folks who works here, Eric, got this out in the woods where he lives on his property. He put it here. That's kind of a continuation of the heritage because Eric is the son of the first ranger who worked here, one of the original family. So the saga continues.
Emerald Mound, the second largest in the U.S., is considered to be a temple mound built around 12 to 1500 A.D. It's located just west of the old Natchez Trace and not far from the Mississippi River. A temple once stood on the 30-foot secondary mound, which sits on top of the west end of Emerald Mound.
Yes, we're here with Mike Hazlip on Emerald Mound. Mike's a park ranger with the National Park Service. As we were driving up to Emerald Mound this morning, we were speculating on how the Indians might have constructed this tremendous site. We said to ourselves, it must have taken a lot of buckets of dirt to build this. Mike, in talking to you, I find out that might not be so far from the truth. Can you fill us in a little bit more about the mound?
Well, yes, Dennis, that's right. Actually, the builders of Emerald Mound here was started around 1250 AD and completed around 1600 AD. These people were referred to as the Mississippians. They got their name not from the state of Mississippi, but because of the large concentrations of mounds and villages in their area. They held ceremonial dances here, and at certain times they held important religious rituals. When DeSoto arrived in the area around 1540, the Mississippians were numerous and powerful. These mounds were still in use. Spanish horsemen mentioned riding to their tops. Emerald Mound actually rises 35 feet and covers 8 square acres. The Mississippians were very skilled farmers. They raised enough corn, squash, and beans to feed a large population. Their houses usually were wood and reed, clay-plastered walls, and thatched roofs. They devised specialized tools and weapons, usually from the materials on hand: stone, shell, wood, and bone. Also, they developed a high level of social and political organization. The flat-top earthen mounds of the Mississippians were used to support temples and ceremonial structures. The earlier and smaller mounds were used to cover burials and tombs. What happened to all these spaces and these great ceremonial centers that DeSoto saw when he arrived in the area? Actually, there were several factors that caused their decline. Disease among DeSoto's party, more vigorous groups that pushed out the already weakened Mississippians, and internal strife. Archaeologists have determined that the builders of the Emerald Mound were ancestors of the Natchez Indians. Today, all that remains of the mounds here, or rather, all that remains of the Mississippians have left behind are remains of their villages and their tools. This is the only link that we have to the builders of the Emerald Mound and the other Mississippian mounds. We're on top of the primary mound. There are two other mounds, secondary mounds on top of the primary mound here.
Mike, thanks for telling everybody about the mound, but I just want to ask you one question. Did you have to do a rain dance?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that was what we had planned for today, to show that the Indians had strong medicine. Actually, from Natchez to here was one sleep, as the Indians used to say, one day's travel. Yes, we had a rain dance today to demonstrate good medicine.
Well, it's nice to come back to the southern end of the trace and see the areas we've seen and the mounds. We've had good hosts with Bob and Mike here. We certainly appreciate your talk, showing of the house and the mounds. And you were there, folks.
Rain or shine, it's a good place to visit.
We're here with Jim Barnett, who is the Director of Historic Properties with the Mississippi State Department of Archives and History. We're at the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians. And Jim, could you tell us a little bit about not only these mounds here at the village, but also the ones that we've just visited at Emerald Mound?
Sure. Emerald Mound is one of the largest Indian earthworks in North America. There's only one or two earthworks larger than it. Emerald is laid out pretty much by the cardinal directions. The big mound on one end of it is on the western end there, and the mound's laid out pretty much east-west there, and that seems to be a pattern among mound sites in this area. And this was the area that was occupied by the tribe that came to be called the Natchez Indians, and Emerald was one of their mound centers. In fact, it was probably their main ceremonial center for the period in the 1500s and early 1600s. The chief of the tribe lived out there, and that was the focus of the tribe, the focus of their religious activities and also their social events. The Natchez people at some point in the 1600s probably shifted the status of their main ceremonial center from Emerald to this site, the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians. Now the Natchez Indians built three mounds, Mound A up in the corner there, Mounds B and C. And they're in a line here, but they're in a line because they were built on a natural levee of St. Catherine Creek, which flows just beyond those trees over there. They took advantage of the levee to gain extra height with the mounds, west is more that way, but that's sort of a compromise between the natural levee using it and putting the big mound, the temple mound down there on the western end of the site. So it was a pattern that's repeated in other mound sites in this area. When the French colonists got here in the late 1600s, early 1700s, this was the place where the chief was living, and this was the place where the French would go to do business with the tribe. This site is a National Historic Landmark, and it's owned by the state of Mississippi and operated by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. That agency has done 3 major excavations here, beginning in 1930, again in 1962, and in 1972. And those excavations looked at the mounds themselves, at the different building levels, and it was determined in the excavations that the mounds were not built up in a single building episode, but were built up in increments. They built up a little platform and used it for a while, then added to that, so that over years, probably over centuries, the mounds reached their present height here. These mounds are reconstructions. The originals were totally excavated in these archaeological digs, and then they were built back up again to the same size and shape and orientation. And this site was a ceremonial center, as I mentioned. The name Grand Village comes to us from the French colonial writings, and it's a little misleading because this was not really a village of Indians living packed together. This was a place where the tribal chief lived, and a few other high-ranking tribal officials lived here on a year-round basis. Everybody else in the tribe lived on family farms scattered throughout the countryside here. And the way they used these places was that they would come together here at the ceremonial centers for monthly feasts and ceremonies, and also not only religious events, but also social events too. The Natchez people were farmers. Their economy was based on farming. They grew corn and beans and squash, and they had a very comfortable lifestyle. They also hunted, they fished, and they also gathered wild things that grow in season around here too. So they had lots of sources of food and had a lot of free time. You've been to Emerald Mound, you've seen how big it is. You can see how much free time those people had to build something like that. And not only build it, but also to maintain it over the centuries too. I'm trying to get over a cold here. But a couple of things I might mention about the Natchez Society. This site is significant because we have 2 sources of information about it. We have the archaeological record that shows the remains of the buildings here and the artifacts that were found here in the ground. And we also have the writings of the French colonists that we can look at and read about their observations of the Natchez people. A couple of things they observed was, one, that this society was a ranked society. There was a rank of nobility on the top and commoners on the bottom. At the very top of the nobility was the royal family called the Sun family, S-U-N, and at the very top of that was the Great Sun, the tribal chief, and he arrived at his position through inheritance. He didn't have to run for office or whatever. He was simply born into the royal family, and the French picked up on this when they were over here because back in Europe they had a class system too and a royalty. In fact, there is another coincidence. The king in France, Louis XIV, was known as the Sun King, and over here the Natchez Indians had their great son who was the chief of the tribe. So there was a similarity there too. But the French found out that everybody in the nobility had to take their mates from the commoner class. Males and females would marry commoners. And also the French found out that this society had a matrilineal kinship system. Instead of family inheritance going from father to son, it was handed down from mother to daughter in this society. The Natchez did not believe that the great chief, that a man could pass on his blood to an offspring. So consequently, the great chief could not pass on his royal blood to his children. His nephew, in fact, would be the next person to succeed him on the throne of chief there, being the oldest son of his sister, who would marry a commoner man. And I know this sounds confusing. It's kind of like kinship algebra or something when you try to sort it out. But the French did make some observations like this about the Natchez people.
That's very interesting. I was wondering if we have time, could we move inside and look at a few of the artifacts that have come out of the mounds?
Okay, one thing I want to mention, just to put this site in some kind of chronological perspective, the culture that became the Natchez Indians is dated at beginning around AD 1200, just about 800 years ago, which is just like yesterday in terms of archaeology. And here in Adams County, we have evidence that people were living here at the end of the last ice age, about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So there were many Indian cultures in this place here that rose and fell over time, leading up to the Natchez culture that was here when the Europeans finally came in and changed everything up. Okay, we can go inside and look at some of the exhibits in there. We're in the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians Museum, and we have some exhibits in here about the archaeological materials that were found at the site in the digs that were carried out here. This exhibit talks about the predecessors of the Natchez and gives an idea of the time depth that I spoke about a few minutes ago. From the early inhabitants of the area, we have this small projectile point, a small spear point there that dates back to about 7,000 BC. On up through time, the different types of stone tools that were used, and leading up to the early experimentation with clay, which produced these clay balls here, and then later on the actual production of pottery. And I guess pottery was probably the most important invention in prehistoric North America. It allowed people to use food more efficiently, to store food, cook food, carry food. It allowed for healthier families and ultimately bigger populations, and led directly to the large Indian populations and civilizations that were here in the late prehistoric times. Quite a few pieces of Natchez pottery were found in the excavations here, mostly in the 1930 excavation is when most of this pottery was dug up. And it's all decorated pottery. The Natchez people made pots that were also undecorated for day-to-day use. These pots were found with human burials here at the site, and that was apparently part of the religious offering to the dead. Notice the design on the pots. If you can get this this illustration up here, it shows a circle with swirling lines coming off of it. That design identifies Natchez Indian pottery when you see it in archaeological sites. The pottery was made by the women of the tribe, and the process they used was the coiling method, because these Indians did not have the use of the wheel to throw pottery on. So they had to coil it by first making a long strip of clay with their fingers, and then coiling that strip on top, one coil on top of the other, until they built up the basic shape for the pot. And then they would use their hands and stones to smooth the pottery down on the sides and on the inside. After the pot had air dried for 2 or 3 weeks probably, they would take a sharp object and scratch these lines in there and make those decorations. And it's difficult to do to decorate a piece of pottery like that by hand with these symmetrical decorations and have it come out right all the way around the pot. It doesn't look that hard when you look at it, but if you try it, it's fairly difficult to make it come out right all the way around. The most important step in the pottery making process was the firing, where they would take all of their raw pots and put them in a pit that they dug in the ground, and then cover that over and put wood in there and build a fire and heat that pottery to a certain point where it would turn it into ceramic and make it very hard and very durable, so that it would last in the ground for hundreds of years and last long enough to be discovered by archaeologists here in modern times. The Natchez Indians did not have a written language. They were like all North American Indians. They only had a spoken language. And so this illustration, this exhibit, illustrates what they had in their mind as far as their calendar year. The Natchez had a very elaborate social system, and throughout the year there were events that they observed, and they would have regular feasting and social gathering, a very active lifestyle. The Natchez calendar was based on the appearances of the new moon, and each moon would signal the beginning of a new month. Right now it would be the Natchez New Year. The Natchez people, like many farming societies around the world, celebrated the New Year not in the dead of winter as we do in American culture, but in the spring, when the nature would renew itself. And the month of the deer was the Natchez New Year. Each month was named after something that was commonly found or grown or hunted during that month. Over here on into the summer, we see watermelons. This is not a native plant from this area. This watermelons came from Africa, transplanted into the Caribbean there in the 16th century, and eventually found its way up here to be used by these Indians, and was here when the watermelons were here when the French came in and found the tribe. But anyway, they had in their mind something similar to this, and this is our way to illustrate that. Other illustrations on the exhibit are illustrations of plants that the French colonists found when they came here, and they made sketches of these plants and took down notes about them to take back and show to the interested people back in Europe.
Jim, before we came to Mississippi, I heard that the people in Mississippi are some of the most hospitable people you will ever want to meet, and we sure want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to visit with us.
Glad to have you here, and good luck with your program.
Thank you very much. Natchez, what an interesting town. We're here now at the Grand Village, and it's 8 miles south of the Trace. The people of Mississippi have been very hospitable. We've had a good time in Mississippi. If you ever get a chance to come down this way, I think you'll find it very interesting. Stop by.
It's been a very interesting trip to Natchez, Mississippi. A few months ago we were on the northern end of the Natchez Trace. Today down on the southern end. We visited a few points. It's a very interesting state park. If you plan in any time in the future to have a motor home or driving trip, we think that it would become very, very highly recommended that you drive the Natchez Trace. There's no commercial vehicles allowed. It's slow paced. Any people we have met along the way are very, very friendly. Again, now we're closing here 8 miles south of the southern end of the Natchez Trace. At this Indian park, they're getting ready to have a powwow here for the next week. There are buses coming in already. And so for now, we'll be closing from Natchez, Mississippi. Thanks for joining us, and you were there, folks. We would like to thank Dale Smith with the National Park Service once again. He made the statement you could not do justice with the picture of Emerald Mound from the ground, as we found out ourselves. So with the weather good on our way home, we were able to get these photos of the 8-acre mound showing how massive Emerald Mound is. And thank you for joining us on this documentary.